What is good? Deepak Chona, SportsMed Analytics, bringing you today's NFL injury updates. Thank you very much for joining. Now let's get it popping. Starting with Christian McCaffrey. Now, the data here actually is very promising for the start of the 25 season. He had the bilateral Achilles tendonitis at the beginning of last year, and he actually did look like he had recovered from that from a performance perspective. He came back, averaged 4 receptions per game, 4 yards per carry, looking overall pretty solid, and the 49ers were feeding him. Then, of course, he had that PCL injury after that. The timeline and the comments around it suggested the PCL was at a moderate severity injury, and these don't typically cause lingering dips into the following season. Now, we saw Puka Nacua actually come back from this in season, and Lamar Jackson had an offseason to recover from what sounded like a higher severity injury of a PCL for him. Neither have had any lasting negative impact from that. The real question with McCaffrey is durability and injury history, and especially the bilateral Achilles tendonitis from last year, the age 29 at the running back position, and you add in that he's had a pretty extensive soft tissue history, even going back to his Carolina Panthers days. So overall, we do project him at double the risk of the average NFL running back. However, when he's healthy, which is likely to be the start of this season, he is likely to look quite good, quite explosive, and taking McCaffrey with a Garendo, not a bad combo there. Next, we have Malik Nabers. So he sat out part of minicamp. They talked about this potential chronic toe issue. Anytime you start hearing a chronic toe issue for a wide receiver, there is going to be some recurrence risk implied by that. It actually sounds like the injury dates back to his college days at LSU, and he managed it even through there and last season as well. So overall, what most likely would happen here is there's a pretty low threshold to sit in June if there's any sort of soreness or injury being managed for what is already a superstar level player entering year 2. So with that in mind, most likely outcome is he participates fully in training camp, in which case the data says there's no higher risk conferred by this chronic toe management. However, if he starts to miss time or miss participation in camp, the data does flip and it does increase his injury risk for the season. So it really becomes a question of how the next several weeks are managed here. We suspect this won't be an issue, and most likely you're probably safe betting on Nabers, but he is a little bit higher risk than the surrounding wide receiver ones at that level ADP. Then we have Rashee Rice. The reports here are bullish. They do line up very much with the injury projection. And if you look at Rashee Rice's injury back in October, they examined his ACL at the time of surgery, decided that did not need a reconstruction, meaning it was not unstable or torn. He did have an LCL injury, a ligament on the outside of the knee, and a hamstring tear, and they fixed all of that basically at the time of the surgery. Typically, you'd be looking at about 6 months to full clearance, as opposed to an ACL, which would put you on average 9 to 11 for most wide receivers. As a result, we would expect his recovery of performance to also be faster than the typical ACL, and the data projects him to be around 90% of his pre-injury level by week 1. There wouldn't be a snap count ramp up that would be needed at this point, given that, like I said, the 6-month clearance is very different than the ACL almost year-long clearance that is needed. So as a result, you don't typically see a snap count ramp up with this type of injury. We would expect Rashee Rice to look very much like his old self, and there's not really a high injury risk conferred by risk of re-aggravation of this one. So overall, promising news there. Then we have Brandon Aiyuk. They're talking about him being ahead of schedule. He had an ACL and MCL surgery back around October is when the injury occurred. We would still lean towards him starting on the PUP. Now, if you actually go back and look at all the times that reporters have said ahead of schedule for players coming off of knee surgical injuries, it actually has no correlation with whether that player returns faster or at the targeted timeline. So the average return would be 11 months, putting him around late October, which is about when we would expect him to come back. But you also typically see an initial performance hit. With Brandon Aiyuk, you're looking at 15 to 20% in our data. And then you also typically see a 4 to 6 game ramp up in routes run and targets. So you're probably not looking at what we're used to seeing from Brandon Aiyuk until about the last third of the season, at which point, if you can stash him that long, he does look to have a pretty promising outlook. Then we have Chris Godwin. So he does project to play week 1. And now the Buccaneers, of course, drafted Emeka Egbuka. You have to wonder if they're looking at that as true Godwin insurance in the case that his recovery doesn't go as smoothly as planned. But in general, the data says 2/3 to play week 1 also does favor a pretty significant efficiency dip of about 20% initially. And as you create further time separation from the injury itself with this, these ankle fracture dislocations tend to rise back close to their pre-injury level, but it takes about 12 months to hit 90%. So that would be around week 8 for Chris Godwin. Again, we expect pretty heavy involvement early on for Emeka Egbuka as Godwin ramps up. Then we have Kenneth Walker. So he reportedly dealing with a mild groin injury towards the end of minicamp. Most of these would recover fully by training camp without any lingering missed time or in-season risk. The one key issue to think about is that if this were to recur during training camp, then that data changes and it would predict that Kenneth Walker would have a higher risk of soft tissue reaggravation in season. Now, he does have a history of some groin injuries and he has some soft tissue core muscle surgery history as well. So with that in mind, we have to keep Kenneth Walker a little bit elevated relative to the average running back, but not significantly so. Then we have Stefon Diggs. This is perhaps my favorite comeback to bet on this year. He had a clean ACL. He had 6 straight 1,000-yard seasons, was right on that pace again, and he hasn't missed more than one game before 2024. Now, he's age 31. That certainly works against him in the data. He's an elite athlete and an elite performer, and the projections, therefore, still favor him being ready to play week 1. Typically, what we would see with Stefon Diggs' archetype is an 85% initial explosiveness relative to his pre-injury. So that you're talking about your speed and your vertical and your cutting ability separation. So with that in mind, you're not looking at immediately 100%, likely until mid-season. 90% projects for week 5, which is when he would be fully ramped up in terms of target volume, according to the data as well. So we're a big fan of the Drake May, Stefon Diggs stacks in the best ball season, given the current ADP of both. Then we have Anthony Richardson. Now, this is a big yellow flag for me. He has a history of an AC joint surgery. The AC joint is right up in this area on his throwing shoulder. So the soreness that came during the early time of the season, the off season back in June, caused him to miss some mini camp. For a star player, that's not that big a deal. Malik Nabers, we talked about, star players have a low threshold to sit during this time of year. However, this is not a star player. This is a young quarterback trying to figure out how to make himself fit in the NFL, and importantly, battling another former high-level pick, Daniel Jones, for playing time itself. So this is not a small thing, in my opinion, that he is sitting or did sit. And furthermore, at this time of year, you're not taking hits. So it makes you think that this aggravation or re-aggravation of his AC joint is potentially likely to recur in season, because if he wasn't taking hits, add in contact plus many, many throws, and we really don't know how well this is going to go for the long run here. Next up, we have David Montgomery of the Lions. Now, the end of last year, you may remember as Jahmyr Gibbs' season and David Montgomery taking a little bit of a downturn. He did miss 3 games in each of the last 2 years, but that's actually right around league average for a running back. He doesn't have any major injury history from injury risk conferred by his injury history. But the one thing to keep in mind is at the end of last year, he had what appears to be a high-grade MCL sprain. They talked about shutting him down, potentially having surgery. He came back accelerated, and he was able to play. The thing about these, though, is that there is a mild recurrence risk, because when the MCL heals, it heals, but it heals a little bit looser than normal. And as a result, there is an increased risk of re-injury with another hit to that area. Not saying it's common, but it's definitely possible. We think this is what happened with Tristan Wirfs of the Bucs O-line, where he had an MCL injury, treated non-operatively towards the end of the season. Then he had a recent, what sounds like re-aggravation of this injury, and now he's having surgical treatment. So Again, we don't have that confirmed on Wirfs, but that is the sort of suspected outcome here based on his overall pathway and timeline, and we're kind of looking at a slight risk as a result for David Montgomery as well. And that's all we have for the moment. Drop your questions and comments in the comments, and we will get to them all shortly. In the meantime, thank you for joining, and we will see you soon.